A single father thought it was just another quiet evening walk with his daughter, until a scream tore through the fog. Within minutes, he would save a stranger's life. A stranger who would return with a secret powerful enough to upend everything he thought he knew. The mist rolled low over the riverbank that evening, curling in pale ribbons across the worn path where Ethan Riley walked with his daughter. The air smelled of damp earth and autumn leaves, heavy with the kind of silence that comes just before night fully claims the sky. Sophie skipped a few steps ahead, her small boots splashing lightly in the shallow puddles left by the afternoon rain. She bent down, chose a flat stone, and with the determined seriousness of a 7-year-old, launched it across the water. It bounced twice before sinking. Her laughter broke the quiet, a sound Ethan never tired of hearing. For him, these walks were more than routine. They were fragments of peace carved out from days spent juggling 2 jobs and nights weighed down by the exhaustion of keeping life steady. He glanced at Sophie's blonde hair glowing faintly in the fading light, and reminded himself that this, her safety, her smile, was why he kept pushing forward, no matter how bone-deep the fatigue ran. Then he heard it. At first, Ethan thought it was the moan of the wind threading through the reeds. But as he paused, listening harder, the sound sharpened into something unmistakable, a cry, faint, broken, carried by the fog. His instincts kicked in before his mind could process. He scanned the river, eyes narrowing against the shifting haze. Then he saw her. In the dark water, arms flailing, a figure struggled against the current. Her movements were desperate, splashing but weakening, her head dipping below the surface more often than it rose. "Dad?" Sophie's voice wavered behind him. "Stay here," Ethan commanded gently but firmly, his voice steady in a way that came from habit. He dropped the bag slung over his shoulder and sprinted down the bank. The river was icy as it closed around him. His lungs seized at the shock, but he pushed forward, powerful strokes cutting through the current. His muscles screamed in protest. 2 jobs had left him strong but constantly drained. Still, some reservoir of strength opened when another life was at stake. His hand reached her just as she slipped under again. Fingers tangled in her jacket, he pulled hard, dragging her upward until her head broke the surface with a gasp. "Hold on!" he gritted, kicking furiously, the weight of her body dragging against his already burning chest. Inch by inch, stroke by stroke, he pushed them toward the shore. Sophie stood frozen on the bank, eyes wide, hands clasped together as if praying. She exhaled in relief when Ethan's arm finally hooked over the muddy edge. With a groan, he hauled the woman out first, then himself, collapsing onto the wet ground. She coughed violently, water streaming from her lips, her body shaking with shivers. Ethan leaned over, steadying her with a strong hand on her back until her breathing evened out. For a moment their eyes met, hers wide, terrified but alive. "Thank you," she whispered hoarsely. Before Ethan could speak, before he could ask her name, she staggered to her feet, wrapped her soaked coat tightly around her, and disappeared into the night fog. Ethan sat there, drenched and breathless, staring at the emptiness she left behind. Who was she? And why vanish after being saved? Morning sunlight spilled across the faded curtains of Ethan's small apartment, softening the edges of the worn furniture. The smell of toast filled the kitchen, and Sophie's voice carried in sing-song as she packed her crayons into her school bag. Ethan moved quietly, laying slices of apple into her lunchbox, his hands working with the steady rhythm of habit. From the outside, it was an ordinary morning, indistinguishable from the hundreds before it. But beneath that calm surface, his mind churned. The river had followed him into his sleep, haunting his dreams with the image of pale arms thrashing in dark water. He could still feel the burn in his lungs, the desperate weight of dragging her to shore, and the shock in her eyes when she whispered that frail "thank you." Most of all, he couldn't shake the way she vanished, like a shadow swallowed by fog. He glanced at Sophie, humming softly as she smoothed the wrinkled straps of her backpack. No, he wouldn't tell her. She was just a child. She didn't need to carry the heaviness of what might have been, or the worry that strangers could drown right in front of them. Protecting her from fear was as much a part of his role as feeding her breakfast or walking her to school. "Ready for math test day?" he asked, forcing a small smile. Sophie wrinkled her nose. "Not really. Fractions are tricky, but I'll try." "That's all anyone can do," Ethan replied, brushing her hair back with a father's tenderness. His words were light, but his chest felt heavy. Later in the parking lot, Ethan coaxed his old pickup to life. The engine sputtered, groaned, then roared reluctantly into gear. He tapped the dashboard affectionately. "Oh, come on, buddy. One more week." Sophie giggled, used to her father talking to the truck as if it were alive. Ordinary moments like these gave Ethan grounding, steady, simple, familiar. But no matter how many tasks filled his day, changing light bulbs at the office, sweeping hallways, emptying trash bins, his mind betrayed him. Between mop strokes and shifts of his weary shoulders, he saw her face. The woman from the river, fragile but fierce enough to walk away into the night. Who was she? Why didn't she stay? By evening, Sophie sat curled on the couch, drawing with colored pencils while Ethan prepared pasta. He caught himself staring out the window toward the direction of the river, as though expecting her silhouette to emerge from the dusk. He shook it off, focusing instead on sprinkling cheese over the boiling pot. When dinner was served, Sophie twirled noodles on her fork, her brow furrowed in thought. Then, without warning, she looked up, her voice small but certain. "Dad," she asked out, "will the lady be okay?" Ethan froze, fork halfway to his mouth. She had seen more than he realized. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as Ethan made his final rounds. The office building was nearly empty, its polished floors reflecting the faint glow of security lamps. He moved with quiet efficiency, pushing his cart down the hallway, keys jingling softly as he locked each door. These late-night routines gave him a strange sense of control, small tasks that balanced out the chaos life had thrown at him. He had just finished securing the last office when a voice echoed through the corridor. "Ethan?" The sound was soft but clear, carrying an unfamiliar confidence that made him freeze. Slowly, he turned, and there she was. The woman from the river. Gone was the shivering, half-drowned figure he had pulled to shore. Tonight, she stood tall, her hair smooth and perfectly styled, her fitted navy blazer catching the light. The heels she wore clicked against the tile with a rhythm that matched the steadiness in her gaze. Her entire presence radiated assurance, the opposite of the fragile stranger he remembered gasping for air. For a moment, Ethan wondered if his exhausted mind was playing tricks. "You?" he managed, his voice low guarded. She smiled faintly. "Clara." She stepped closer, extending a hand. "I didn't get to introduce myself properly last night." Ethan hesitated before taking her hand, noting the firmness of her grip. "You tracked me down." Her lips curved, a mix of apology and amusement. "I had to. I don't like leaving debts unpaid." "You saved my life." He studied her carefully, suspicion flickering behind his tired eyes. People didn't just disappear into the fog one night and reappear the next, dressed like they were stepping out of a boardroom. "You could have just said thank you," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "I tried," she replied smoothly, "but I was half-conscious and freezing." "Hardly counts." She paused, her gaze softening. "I wanted to do it right, properly." He frowned slightly, his instinctive caution rising. "Why me?" Her brows lifted. "'Cause you risked everything without knowing who I was. Most people would have walked away." The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Clara took a breath. "Dinner. Let me thank you properly." "No strings, just—" "Gratitude." Ethan's first impulse was to refuse. He didn't have time for strangers with mysterious smiles and expensive clothes. His world revolved around Sophie, not candlelit meals. Yet something in Clara's tone, sincere, steady, almost disarming, made him pause. He shifted uncomfortably.
I don't usually
do dinners. Then call it a meal, she said softly, almost playfully. You eat, I eat. That's all. Her persistence unsettled him, but her eyes held no mockery, no false charm. Just intent, Ethan exhaled slowly. Against his better judgment, he nodded once. All right, dinner. Clara's smile widened, not triumphant but warm. Tomorrow night? Ethan said nothing, only gave the smallest nod before turning back to his cart. Still, long after she left, her presence lingered like a question he couldn't answer. The restaurant's soft glow spilled across polished wood tables, the air warm with the scent of roasted herbs and garlic. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, tugging at the collar of his worn button-down. He wasn't used to places like this, places where the servers glided silently, and the wine list was longer than the dinner menu. Across from him, Clara looked perfectly at ease. She had traded the navy blazer for a simple but elegant dress, its lines sharp yet understated. Everything about her seemed composed, too composed, Ethan thought, as if every gesture had been rehearsed. Thank you for agreeing to this, she said, her smile practiced but not insincere.
I wanted a chance to actually speak with you, not just gasp out a half-breath of gratitude. Ethan gave a short nod.
You don't owe me anything.
I just did what anyone would have done. Her eyes softened.
Not everyone would have. The conversation began smoothly enough. Clara asked about Sophie, her age, her favorite things, the schools nearby. When Ethan spoke about her, his guarded expression eased, his voice warming in a way that drew a faint smile from Clara. But whenever he shifted the focus back, asking about her family or work, Clara's replies turned vague. I move around a lot, she said once, stirring her drink as though it might reveal the next answer. Doing what?
Ethan pressed. Projects.
Different kinds. Nothing exciting? She redirected quickly.
But you said you work nights too.
It didn't sit right. Her gratitude seemed genuine, but her words carried careful distance, as though every detail of her own life was wrapped in invisible locks. The tension broke for a moment when Sophie leaned forward, her small elbows on the table. You look like someone from TV, she said brightly, her wide eyes innocent. Clara froze. For a fraction of a second, something sharp flickered in her gaze. Then, just as quickly, she laughed lightly, brushing the comment aside.
I get that a lot.
Must be one of those faces. But Ethan had seen it, the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her hand tightened around the stem of her glass before she let go. He didn't push. Sophie, satisfied with her observation, returned to nibbling at her bread roll. The rest of the meal carried a strange rhythm. Clara was attentive, listening closely, asking questions that drew Ethan out more than he intended. Yet behind her polite interest was a wall he couldn't get past. When the plates were cleared and the check discreetly slid onto the table, she insisted on covering it. Ethan didn't argue. Outside, the night air was cool, a faint breeze carrying the scent of rain. Ethan offered quietly, I'll walk you home. Clara's response came quicker than he expected.
That won't be necessary. Her voice was polite, but firm. Before he could say anything else, a sleek black car rolled up to the curb.
Its tinted windows reflected the streetlights, its polished frame whispering of money and status. A driver in a crisp suit stepped out to open the door. Clara gave Ethan a small smile, softer this time, but no less guarded.
Good night. And then she was gone, the door shutting firmly, the car gliding away into the darkness. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, Sophie's hand in his, a knot forming in his chest.
Whoever Clara was, she wasn't just a woman he pulled from the river. The days after their dinner settled into something strange, almost surreal. Ethan wasn't sure what to make of it. Clara kept reappearing in ways that felt too intentional to be chance. On Monday afternoon, Sophie skipped into their apartment, clutching a book she hadn't owned that morning.
"Clara gave it to me,"
she announced proudly. Ethan frowned as he turned the hardback over in his hands. The title was a children's classic, the kind Sophie had been begging for, but he couldn't justify splurging on. Inside the cover was a note written in elegant handwriting for Sophie. "Every brave explorer needs stories. She found me outside school," Sophie explained cheerfully. "She said reading makes the world bigger." Ethan's chest tightened. Gratitude battled unease. Clara didn't owe them anything, yet she was crossing boundaries with a kind of quiet certainty, weaving herself into Sophie's life without asking. By Wednesday, she appeared again, this time at Ethan's workplace. He was wiping down a hallway when he caught sight of her reflection in the polished floor. She was holding 2 coffees, her smile casual, but her presence out of place among mop buckets and supply carts. "I thought you might need this," she said, handing him the cup. He accepted reluctantly, the warmth seeping into his calloused fingers.
"You really didn't have to." "Maybe I wanted to." Her tone carried an edge, like she knew he didn't quite trust her and wasn't going to explain why.
She stayed only a few minutes before slipping away, leaving Ethan staring after her, unsettled. It wasn't just her persistence that bothered him, it was the shadows trailing her. Twice now, he had noticed men in dark suits loitering near the edges of her visits at Sophie's schoolyard.
Outside his building.
They didn't look like ordinary passers-by. Their posture was rigid, their gaze too sharp. And their eyes weren't on him. They lingered on Clara, watching every move she made. Ethan's instincts prickled. He had lived long enough to recognize surveillance when he saw it. The unease deepened Friday night. Ethan and Sophie were walking home after grabbing takeout, Sophie skipping ahead with her small paper bag of fries. The street lamps threw long shadows across the cracked sidewalks. Ethan sensed movement before he saw her. Clara stepped out from an alleyway, her dress replaced with jeans and a hoodie, her face pale beneath the glow of the streetlight.
"Ethan,"
she whispered urgently, her hand clutching his arm.
"Listen to me. If anyone asks, you don't know me." He froze, Sophie's laughter echoing faintly a few steps ahead.
Clara's grip tightened, her eyes wide with something raw. Fear. "What are you talking about?" Ethan asked in a low voice, instinctively glancing around. Across the street, 2 men leaned against a car, pretending to scroll on their phones. Their presence felt wrong, calculated. Clara's words came out clipped, like every second mattered.
"Please, I can't explain right now."
"Just promise me, if anyone asks, you've never met me." And then she slipped back into the night,
Vanishing as quickly as she had appeared.
leaving Ethan rooted to the spot, his pulse pounding, the fries in Sophie's bag suddenly smelling like ashes. Ethan didn't like shadows hanging over his life, and Clara was becoming one. The next evening, when she appeared again, this time at the diner where he sometimes brought Sophie for a rare treat, he didn't let the moment slip away. He waited until Sophie excused herself to the restroom, then leaned across the booth table, his voice low but steady. "Enough games," he said, eyes fixed on hers. "Why are men in suits watching you?"
And why drag me into it?
Clara's fork stilled above her plate, her expression unreadable. For a long beat, she didn't answer. Then she tilted her head slightly, offering a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're imagining things, Ethan," he shook his head. "I don't imagine trained surveillance. Protocols, positions, angles. That's not everyday knowledge." The faintest flicker crossed her face. Annoyance? Regret? She set the fork down gently, folding her hands together. "Sometimes people carry more past than they can show," she said carefully. "That doesn't mean it has to matter." But the slip was already there. Protocols. A word too sharp, too precise, too professional to come from an ordinary woman with no secrets. Before Ethan could push further, Sophie reappeared, bouncing happily into the booth. "Dad, can Clara come over for pancakes tomorrow?" "You promised Saturday pancakes." Ethan hesitated, caught off guard. Sophie's wide eyes sparkled with that irresistible blend of innocence and hope. Clara looked just as surprised, but for the first time her polished armor cracked. A genuine laugh escaped her, soft and warm. "Pancakes?" she asked, glancing at Ethan. He studied her carefully, searching for traps behind the smile. But something about the way she looked at Sophie, unrehearsed, tender, made his chest loosen despite himself. "Fine," he said reluctantly.
Pancakes?
"But just breakfast." Sophie clapped her hands, victorious. Yay! The rest of the meal passed with lighter tones. Clara asked Sophie about school projects, listened intently to her tales about math quizzes and art class. Ethan noticed the way her body relaxed around the child, the edges softening in ways they never did with him. For those fleeting minutes, she wasn't guarded or mysterious. She was simply human. When they finally left the diner, the night air was cool, carrying the faint hum of traffic. Clara's sleek black car pulled up almost instantly, headlights slicing through the darkness. Ethan crossed his arms as she slipped inside. "Pancakes," she said, with a small smile before the driver pulled away. Sophie tugged on Ethan's sleeve as they started walking home. She waited until the car had disappeared down the street before speaking in a hushed voice.
"Dad? Yes, kiddo?"
Her tone was solemn now, her small hand tightening around his.
"Clara's nice, but—"
She's scared.
"I can tell." Ethan stopped mid-step, staring at his daughter.
The child's perception cut deeper than any of his suspicions. He glanced back at the empty road, the night suddenly heavier. If Sophie could feel Clara's fear, then the danger circling them all was closer than he wanted to admit. The knock came long after dark. Ethan frowned, glancing at the clock, past 10. Sophie had been asleep for an hour. Few people ever came to their door this late. He moved cautiously, instincts humming, and when he opened it, Clara stood there, not polished, not composed. Her hair was damp from rain, her eyes wild. "I can't go home," she whispered. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. He searched her face, measuring truth against fear. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of her practiced poise. Finally, he stepped aside. "Come in." Clara crossed the threshold as if stepping into a sanctuary. The warmth of the small apartment seemed to steady her trembling hands. Ethan shut the door and locked it, his mind already racing. "You want to tell me what's going on?" he asked. She sank onto the couch, clutching the edge of a cushion.
"Not everything, not yet."
"But there are people, powerful people, who want me silenced. I've been hiding in plain sight for years, building a life no one could trace. But lately, they've found cracks." Her voice faltered, her usual control slipping away. Ethan studied her. He'd heard similar tones overseas, soldiers describing enemies that never stopped hunting. Clara wasn't inventing this fear. She was living it. Still, he didn't press. He pulled a blanket from the chair and handed it over. "You can stay here tonight. Couch isn't much, but it's safe." For a long time, silence filled the small living room. Rain pattered softly against the window. Clara leaned back, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. In the dim light, her face looked younger, almost fragile. "You're not asking questions," she said quietly. Ethan shrugged. "If you want to talk, you will. If you don't, I won't force it." Her lips curved faintly as if unused to such patience. "Most people demand answers." "I'm not most people." It was close to midnight when Ethan finally retreated to his bedroom. Clara remained on the couch, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Her mind swirled with dangers unnamed, choices that had led her here. For the first time in years, she felt something resembling peace. A soft creak drew her attention. Sophie, hair mussed from sleep, padded into the living room, clutching her stuffed rabbit. She blinked at Clara, then without hesitation, climbed onto the couch beside her. "Can't sleep," Sophie murmured. "Dad hums to me when I'm scared." Clara hesitated, unsure, then found herself humming a melody she hadn't touched since childhood, a lullaby buried deep in memory. Sophie's breathing slowed, her small body curling against her side. Clara's throat tightened unexpectedly. When Ethan checked a while later, he froze in the doorway. There they were, Sophie asleep, Clara still awake, but softer than he'd ever seen her, humming in the half-light. It was an image he hadn't expected, an intruder in their lives now looking like family. And though questions still loomed, Ethan couldn't deny what he felt in that moment. Clara belonged here, even if the world outside was determined to tear her away. The morning began like any other. Ethan rose before dawn, making coffee in the chipped mug he'd used since his army days. Sophie padded into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, chattering about her science project. For a brief moment, everything felt normal, ordinary, safe. Then the television in the corner caught Ethan's attention. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. High-profile CEO reported missing amid investor conflict. A photograph appeared. Sharp copper hair, commanding gaze, tailored suit.
Ethan froze, the mug suspended halfway to his lips.
He didn't need the reporter to say the name. Clara. His eyes darted toward the living room. She stood silently by the window, arms crossed, staring at her own image on the screen.
No disguise now. No pretense.
Just truth laid bare by a news anchor's polished words. Sophie tilted her head.
Dad, that's her. Ethan muted the TV, the room heavy with silence.
So, he said finally, his voice steady though his chest tightened. You're not Clara. Clara turned, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. It's my middle name. My real name is Cassandra Lane, CEO of Lane Dynamics. Her lips curved into a bitter smile. Or at least that's who the world thinks I am. The truth is more complicated. Ethan leaned back against the counter, arms folded. And the truth is what exactly? That you let me and my daughter believe you were just some stranger from the river? Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't look away.
I wanted anonymity.
For years I've been a prisoner of boardrooms, contracts and cameras. Every move monitored, every word twisted. When I was attacked that night at the river, it wasn't random. It was a warning from people who want me gone.
Disappearing was my only option.
But then you pulled me out of that water, and I couldn't just vanish without facing you again. Ethan studied her, torn between anger and understanding.
You should have told me. I couldn't, she whispered.
The fewer people who know, the safer it is. For you, for Sophie. Her eyes softened as they shifted toward the little girl, now absorbed in drawing at the table. But being here, even for one night, reminded me of what I've never had. A family. Safety that isn't measured in money or contracts. Ethan exhaled slowly. He wanted to push her away, to shield Sophie from the danger now pressing at their doorstep. Yet something inside him recognized the honesty in her confession. Clara Cassandra wasn't just running from power struggles. She was running from a life that had stripped her of humanity. Saving you didn't just happen by chance, she said quietly, stepping closer. I think it was the first time in years someone saw me not as a headline, but as a person. And I couldn't ignore that bond. Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd spent years avoiding entanglements, protecting Sophie by staying invisible. Now this woman, with secrets too heavy for anyone to bear, was pulling them into her world, and, despite every warning flashing in his mind, Ethan knew one thing with certainty. Nothing about their lives would ever be the same again. The air inside the apartment felt heavier after Clara's confession. The silence between her and Ethan stretched, thick with unspoken truths. Sophie's laughter in the other room was the only sound anchoring Ethan to the fragile normalcy he fought so hard to protect. You can't stay here, Ethan said finally. His voice clipped, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Whatever you're running from, it doesn't belong near Sophie. My daughter has already lost too much. Clara flinched, but her chin lifted.
You think I don't know that?
You think I want to drag anyone else into this? Her voice wavered.
I didn't come here to endanger you. I came because I didn't know where else to go. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Then you should have kept running. Kept hiding! Her shoulders dropped, her polished composure cracking.
They're not going to stop, Ethan. Investors, rivals, people who see me as nothing but leverage. They want my company or my silence. If I disappear, they'll take everything. And if I fight them, they'll make sure I disappear anyway. Ethan rubbed his temples. the ache behind his eyes pulsing harder with every word. "I'm not letting Sophie get caught in the crossfire." Before Clara could respond, Sophie skipped back into the kitchen, holding her drawing.
"Dad, look, it's us!"
She pointed proudly to a crayon sketch of 3 stick figures holding hands. Clara's eyes softened as she crouched to Sophie's level, brushing a strand of hair from the little girl's face. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice trembling with something Ethan couldn't name. Ethan swallowed hard, guilt tugging at him. He wanted to tell Sophie to go back to her room, to shield her from what was unraveling. But before he could speak, headlights swept across the apartment wall, the rumble of an engine. The low growl of tires on gravel. Ethan stiffened. His instincts sharpened in an instant, the soldier buried inside him snapping awake. He moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see. A black SUV idled across the street. Its tinted windows reflected only the faint glow of the street lamp, but Ethan's gut told him everything he needed to know. Shadows shifted inside, watching, waiting. He turned sharply.
Clara, her face had drained of color. "They found me," Ethan's mind raced.
Routes of escape, potential weapons, the vulnerability of thin apartment walls. He looked at Sophie, who was still clutching her drawing, oblivious to the storm closing in. He crouched down, forcing calm into his voice. "Sweetheart, go to your room. Lock the door. Don't open it until I say so." Sophie blinked, sensing the urgency beneath his words. She nodded silently and ran. Clara's hands shook as she whispered, "What will you do?" Ethan's gaze hardened. "What I swore I'd never do again." His broad shoulders squared, his stance shifting from weary father to something far more dangerous. "Protect what's mine."
"Whatever it takes." The SUV's engine cut off.
The doors opened, shadows moved closer, and Ethan knew. His past wasn't just back. It was already at his door. The first crack came from the back door, a splintering pop that shattered the fragile calm. Ethan's body reacted before his mind did. He grabbed Sophie's school backpack from the counter, quietly stuffing it with a flashlight, a blanket, and the small first aid kit he always kept near. "Clara," he hissed, keeping his voice low but firm.
"Take Sophie."
"Stay quiet. Stay down!" Clara's eyes widened in panic, but she obeyed, retreating towards Sophie's room. Ethan crouched by the kitchen drawers, pulling out the heaviest wrench he could find. His fingers gripped it like a weapon forged for this moment. The door swung open. 2 men in dark clothing slipped inside, their footsteps careful, deliberate.
They thought they were the predators.
Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind already mapping every inch of the apartment, the shadows, the choke points, the angles of approach. Years of training snapped back like a muscle memory he'd sworn never to use. The first intruder moved toward the hallway.
Ethan stepped out suddenly, swinging the wrench in a brutal arc. Metal slammed against bone with a sickening crack.
The man crumpled before he could cry out. The second raised a knife, lunging forward. Ethan pivoted, grabbing a wooden chair and slamming it into the attacker's chest. They crashed into the table, dishes shattering across the floor. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pinned the man's wrist, twisting until the knife clattered free.
A sharp elbow to the jaw finished it.
Silence fell, broken only by Clara's muffled gasp from the hallway. Then came the sound of boots. More of them. Ethan pulled the fallen knife into his grip, scanning the apartment.
"Up!" he barked softly.
Clara hurried out with Sophie clutched in her arms. The little girl's face was pale but dry-eyed, trusting her father completely. "Window," Ethan ordered. He kicked open the frame, the cool night air rushing in. Clara hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. Go." His tone allowed no argument. Clara climbed out carefully, passing Sophie through first. Ethan turned as another intruder appeared in the doorway. He charged, knife raised high. Ethan sidestepped, slamming the man against the wall with brutal precision. One strike to the throat, another to the ribs, and the fight ended as quickly as it began. By the time he slipped through the window, Clara and Sophie were crouched behind a dumpster in the alley, hearts pounding. Clara's eyes locked onto him as he dropped down beside them, his chest heaving, his hands steady, his face set in cold determination. "You're not just some janitor," she whispered.
Voice trembling between awe and fear. Ethan wiped blood from his brow, shaking his head. "I'm a dad who doesn't quit. That's all you need to know," but Clara knew better.
She had seen the truth in his movements, the control, the efficiency, the precision no ordinary man carried. And for the first time, she realized the danger hunting her wasn't just outside. It lived in the secrets Ethan was still hiding. The safe house was nothing like Ethan expected. From the outside, it looked like any forgotten cabin tucked at the edge of the woods, its shutters weathered, its driveway cracked with weeds. Inside, however, it was layered with quiet strength, reinforced doors, secure windows, surveillance monitors humming softly in the corner. Clara had planned for this. She set Sophie on the worn couch, wrapping her in a blanket. The little girl leaned into Ethan's side, her small hand gripping his sleeve. He kissed the top of her head, grateful beyond words that she was safe. Clara moved about the room with restless energy, checking locks, securing blinds. But when she turned back to face Ethan, her eyes no longer carried only fear. They carried determination. "For years," she began, her voice low, "I thought safety meant shutting everyone out, controlling every variable, building walls higher than anyone could climb." She paused, her gaze flicking to Sophie, who was slowly drifting to sleep against her father's chest. "But tonight proved me wrong."
Isolation doesn't protect. It only leaves you alone when the storm comes. Ethan watched her carefully, noting the tremor in her hands, the weight behind her words.
"You've been fighting shadows by yourself for too long," he said evenly. "That ends now." Clara took a slow breath as though steadying herself.
"I know who's behind this."
"The men after me, they're not random mercenaries. They work for a consortium of investors who want my company stripped, gutted, and sold. They've tried intimidation, manipulation, blackmail. I always thought if I stood alone I could resist them. But they found ways to break through every defense." Her jaw tightened.
"Except this one," she gestured lightly toward Ethan and Sophie.
"Not walls."
"Not cameras, people." Ethan shifted Sophie gently, laying her across the couch.
Then he stood, crossing the room until he faced Clara directly. "So what's the plan?" Clara blinked at him, surprised.
"You're not walking away?"
"You saved Sophie tonight as much as I did," he replied. "And whether I like it or not, this fight is at our doorstep."
"I'm not about to turn my back now." Something softened in her expression, the icy armor she wore finally cracking.
"Then we do this together." They sat at the table, papers spread between them, documents Clara had smuggled out, encrypted files containing proof of the conspiracy. Ethan leaned in, analyzing routes, weak points, backup plans. He wasn't just protecting anymore. He was strategizing. Clara, used to carrying the burden alone, found herself leaning into his calm precision. When Sophie stirred, murmuring in her sleep, Clara paused, watching the girl's peaceful face. "She trusts me," Clara whispered. "She sees the real you," Ethan answered quietly. For a long moment, silence filled the cabin, not heavy, but steady, like the calm after a storm. Clara reached across the table, her hand brushing Ethan's. Not a plea, not a promise, just a choice. For the first time, she wasn't choosing isolation. She was choosing them. The boardroom looked nothing like the battlefield Ethan had fought in, but the tension was the same. Journalists packed the edges, cameras flashing, while the board members of Clara's company shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Clara stood at the head of the table, her voice firm, her evidence undeniable. Documents, recordings, and financial trails unfolded on the screen behind. Her, proof of the investors' schemes to dismantle. Her company and funnel billions into shadow accounts. For weeks, they had whispered that the missing CEO had abandoned her throne. Now, she returned, not just as the leader they knew, but as the woman who had survived betrayal and come back sharper than ever. Each piece of evidence dismantled her enemy's power, stripping away their facade. By the time the presentation ended, silence filled the room. Clara straightened her shoulders and declared, "Montgomery Enterprises will not be sold. It will not be stolen. It will stand." Applause erupted. Not the polite kind, but genuine. Investors who had wavered now leaned forward, eager again to be at her side. The villains were finished. Clara had reclaimed what was hers, not only the company, but her name, her voice, her strength. When it was over, Ethan waited outside, Sophie's hand in his. He didn't belong in boardrooms or spotlights, and he didn't want to. But as Clara stepped through the doors, triumphant and steady, she looked first for them. Sophie ran into her arms and Clara bent down, unafraid of the cameras, unafraid of the world watching. For once, being seen was no longer a threat, it was freedom. Weeks later, the world had moved on from scandal and headlines. Life found its rhythm again, not grand or extraordinary, but real. Ethan sat in the crowded school auditorium, adjusting Sophie's costume wings before she hurried backstage for her class play. Parents chatted around him, laughter rising in the hum of anticipation. He felt almost invisible again until Clara slid into the seat beside him. Her presence turned heads. The polished CEO, known for her power, was clapping along with neighborhood parents, smiling with a warmth that softened her edges. She leaned toward Ethan, her whisper low enough that only he could hear. "Do you think she'll forget her lines?" He smirked.
Not a chance.
"She practiced in front of me every night this week." The lights dimmed, the curtain rose, and Sophie appeared on stage, her small voice carrying proudly through the hall. Clara clapped the loudest, her laughter mingling with Ethan's as they cheered her on. In that moment, no conspiracies, no shadows, no masks existed, just family. When the play ended, Sophie waved from the stage, eyes sparkling at the sight of them sitting together. Ethan and Clara's eyes met, unspoken words flowing between them.
Not rescue. Not obligation. Choice. As the crowd stood, the three of them walked out into the cool evening air.
Ethan reached for Clara's hand and she didn't hesitate. Their story had begun with water and fear, but it continued now with trust and quiet certainty. A beginning.